What do you know about calendar talks? Maybe you've tried them yourself and maybe you're learning about them for the first time. In today's episode, I speak with John Sifert, a Spanish teacher in Iowa. John, aka Padre de Cinco, walks us through the many benefits of using calendar talk activities, along with actionable suggestions for engaging students in speaking about a variety of topics that go well beyond just saying the date. Whether calendar talks are new to you or you're looking for some new ways to enhance how you're already using them, you will walk away from this episode with actionable tips and suggestions. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and you know, every time, gotta start by saying you're an incredible language teacher. And why do I say that to you? How do I know that? Because you're listening to a podcast about language teaching. That right there tells me that you're an incredibly dedicated language teacher. So thank you so much for doing that. So today we're going to be talking about calendar talk. Now, you likely have heard this. It's a term that comes up in terms of the looking at CI teaching and our communicative classrooms. But I wanted to get some details about it today. And I'll be honest, particularly for myself, this is something I want to be doing more of, and I needed to get some insights. So I reached out to John Sifert, who you might know out in the social media world as Padre de Cinco, so the dad of 5, and it's because he does have 5 children. So he has a wealth of knowledge and insights to share with us from his experience with doing this. So he is a Spanish teacher in Iowa. He did a stint of teaching in Texas early on in his career, but he is at year 27. So he's been at this game for a while. And he has presented on calendar talks and lots of other topics at a number of conferences. You may have seen him at ACTFL or IWALA. Again, shout out to a state language association, CI Iowa, which is also an organization in Iowa, and also in Kansas, and doing some of the practical and comprehensible conference and comprehended and CI reboot, a lot of those virtual things as well. So he has a lot to share. So we're going to bring him into this conversation and we're going to start talking about calendar talk. So John Sifert, welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Joshua. I really appreciate it. I've listened to many of your episodes in the past, and so I can't wait to share with your listeners.
Is there anything that you want to share personally about yourself, your teaching, that I didn't cover in there to get to know you a little better, or does that pretty much cover it?
My personal life is pretty much either teaching or my family, and that's kind of how I adopted the idea of Padre de Cinco. Mm-hmm. So it just really reflects my priorities, I guess. I mean, teaching is wonderful, but it comes family first.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can see it right in your name. You know, you see how this person identifies right in the name. That's wonderful. And I had asked you before we started, but in case people are curious, so you have 2 sets of twins amongst those 5, right? So how has that experience been of having 2 sets of twins in your family?
Oh, it's been amazing, to be honest. Some people say that, oh, weren't you overwhelmed? Because we had 5 kids in 6 years. And because of that, it was super busy. Yeah, there was quite a few years where we were running pretty ragged, but I wouldn't have done it any other way. I loved that. It was amazing.
Thank you so much for sharing that piece. So let's get going talking about calendar talk. Now, can you explain to us, in case this is a new concept to some of our listeners, what a calendar talk is and why is this something that we should consider doing in our world language classrooms?
Well, it comes from the basic idea, of course, that the vocabulary and phrases that you find with a calendar are very common things that are taught in the world language classroom. And because of that, it can be sometimes a little stale. After a few days, few weeks, doing the same thing over and over again, gets boring for our students, just like anything else. So calendar talk is an idea where you take the basics and expand it in different directions so that it doesn't get stale, so the students feel invested, and you can make it personalized as well, which is a big thing in TCI, like teaching with comprehensible input.
So when we're talking about this idea of calendar talk, so when is this happening in a class period? Like, let's get to the nuts and bolts of it. Are you doing this first, middle, last? When is this happening?
Okay, I'm a big person for having routines, and my students come in. We have kind of a bell ringer activity like many teachers do. And then after that, I have a system of class jobs, which is a whole nother avenue I could go down sometime. But classroom jobs kind of encapsulate part of our community. That's one of the big things that I really focus on in my classroom is community. And a section of those classroom jobs have to do with the calendar. And so because of that, I have students, several jobs that feed off of that. One is pretty basic. They put up the calendar. I have a physical calendar and a digital calendar, but the physical one they put up themselves, and there's one student in charge of reading it. That's kind of like the basic level. That's where a lot of teachers stop. But there's so much more you can do with a calendar besides that basic level of, deciding what the weather's like or the day of the week that it is today or the temperature. And so I kind of have a little focus that I'm going to go into about how you can do that to make it more than just that basic.
Right. So you have these jobs, and one of the jobs is focused on the calendar there. And just we'll get into sort of the logistics of exactly what it looks like. But I'm thinking of this as being a component of a comprehensible input focused classroom. So that would mean, and please reiterate this or correct me if I'm wrong, but the whole purpose of a calendar talk is it's happening in the target language.
Yes, for sure.
So now let's get into the logistics of it. Okay, so we're starting a calendar talk. Senor Sifert gets up and it's time to do a calendar talk. And let's take a particular class so that we kind of stay focused on it's that same proficiency level. We'll talk about different levels after, but choose any class and we'll focus on that. And you're starting a calendar talk. So what is that going to look like if I'm a student in your class?
Let's start off with like a level 2 class, maybe novice mid, novice high, something like that. So I do have a student who their basic job will be to read the stuff on the calendar, the day, the date, the weather, and so on. That should be very easy at this point. That shouldn't be something that anybody in the classroom struggles with. The next step is we actually switch over to a virtual calendar that I have some slides up on the screen. In the presentation, there's a slide that I use for scaffolding with the calendar talk, actually several that I use for scaffolding. And I think that's very important no matter what level you're discussing, making sure that the students have the necessary pieces if they don't have all of the language acquired, of course. A couple of my classroom jobs, like I mentioned, are the sports director and the events director. Part of their job during the bell ringer time is to look up, hey, what's going on in our school that day? And they're going to be presenting on that in the target language. Now, on the scaffolding slide, there are some basic phrases like práctica, partido, or competencia, phrases that would relate to sports, and also some other phrases like concierto or conferencias or reunión, so things having to do with concerts and conferences and so on. So then our students report out on that to the whole class. It's a vital piece of community in that case because it's something that's going to be interesting to them. Most of our students are involved in some activity in the school, whether it be sports or concerts or art shows or whatever it might be. And by bringing in activities that they're already part of, that definitely makes it much more personalized when we're talking about what's going on in the day.
So let me ask a question, a logistics question about that piece right there where they're gathering this information. What resources are you providing or are they accessing to gain that information to share out?
Well, for us, our district is 1-to-1. So everybody has their own laptop, and so they can just use the school website. That's our easiest way. Before we were 1-to-1, when I did calendar talk, our school used to publish large event posters, and I would have one in my room, and students could go and look and see, oh yeah, there's a concert tonight or a musical performance or whatnot. And so whatever resources your school puts out, it could be the announcements or it could be anything. Whatever your school provides to report out to the community, I guess.
And with these jobs, do they last a day? Do they last a week? How long do students have that particular job of reporting out on that topic?
Now, that's an interesting question just because it all depends on your system. I know some people that keep the same jobs all year long or for a semester. My sweet spot has turned out to be about half a quarter, about 4 to 5 weeks. That's really what's worked
Mhm.
well for me. That keeps it from being stale, but also lets them experience a job and settle in and really get the whole feel of how it's supposed to work.
The scaffolding that you talked about earlier, like you have slides that are scaffolded. So, can you talk to us about what students are actually seeing on those slides and scaffold us through what your, I'm going to call it a script, but I think it's more
Mm.
organic than that, but what
Yeah.
sort of your talking points are?
So after the basic date and weather and all that, usually the first thing that comes up is we ask, is there a birthday? So we'll ask about birthdays, like, hay un cumpleaños hoy, and students will share out on that. And that's more of an organic thing because it might be, somebody's sister's birthday or their boyfriend's birthday
Mhm.
or their grandpa's birthday. And so we discuss that and we can talk about, oh yeah, it's this person's birthday too. Or we'll ask them how old they are. And so sometimes it goes beyond the calendar and it still uses great comprehensible vocabulary and phrases, but not necessarily always focused on the calendar. But the calendar becomes a great jumping off point for lots and lots of conversation.
As you are engaging with language as students, I'm assuming that what comes up is students need language. They need new words, that you're going to have to add those in as you're going through. They might not know the word for great grandfather
Mhm.
or cousin or whatever that is that might be needed to have that conversation. So, how are you, or are you tracking that new vocabulary? And if so, where do you put it? Or maybe
Mm.
not. Talk to us about what that means when you're engaging in new vocabulary coming up in these conversations.
Over the years, I've gotten a pretty good feel about what kind of words are often going to come up. And because of that, those, of course, are on my scaffolded slides, the ones that are I know are going to come up almost on a daily basis.
Mhm.
The other ones, I have a lot of posters and word walls in my classroom. I'll usually direct students to those places. And if it's something that I just wasn't anticipating, we'll write it on the board. And I don't necessarily keep track of all those. If it's a
Mhm.
word that's so rare or random, and it's not a super common word, there's no reason for them to write it down or me
Mhm.
to force them to remember it because if it was that important, it would come up more often.
When you're going through the slides, I'm assuming you have some sort of template for them.
Mhm.
Do you have templates for your slides? And so
Yes.
what do those look like and how many slides are we talking about?
I usually have, it's really just 2 or 3 basic ones for the calendar talk because calendar talk can last 30 seconds. It can last 10, 20 minutes. I don't really have a cutoff necessarily because my class is very organic. I don't have a set curriculum necessarily. I have things in my lesson plans that I would like to do, but if we don't get done with it today, it carries over to tomorrow or next week or whatever. So I don't really say, okay, calendar talk's going to be 3.5 minutes and we're moving on to the intro and then the next lesson. It just happens kind of organically. So
Mhm.
what I really like is if it's 5 minutes or 10 minutes of my day, that's already in a regular, let's say 50-minute period, that's 10 to 20% of your lessons already accounted for every day. And it's quality input that's of interest to the students. That's really why I love Calendar Talk because we try to bring in as many things that make it personalized as possible.
And so, what are some of those activities that you do that keep it interactive with students as you're going through?
One thing I like to do is compare weather, for example, comparing weather around the world. Like the basic level of calendar is talking about the weather, but in your local environment. But I do have a scaffolded slide. In my case, since I teach Spanish, it has the flags of all of the 21 Spanish speaking countries on it. So I'll ask the students, again, this is all in the target language, what's the weather like today in whatever country? And then I usually will actually have them choose because, again, try to be as interactive as possible. So we'll choose a country. The slide is already linked. So every flag actually has a link to that Spanish speaking country's weather.com site. And so we'll click on it. We'll get to see the weather. It's already listed in Spanish. And then we'll start doing some comparisons. Okay. Which place is hotter? Which one has more rain on average? Would you rather be here or there? If you could choose, would you live in this country? I mean, there's so many jumping off points that you can have with little conversations like that. You could even compare with, okay, yesterday we looked at Argentina. Why is
Mhm.
Argentina so much colder than Costa Rica? And then we can talk about, oh, look, they're in a different season of the year than the other country. So we can discuss that and talk about geography and look it up on Google Maps. There are so many directions that it's all focused still on providing as much input in the language as possible. So do I really care with the specifics that we're talking about as long as they're getting the language?
So when we're looking at the word calendar, we think about, oh, it's the date. The calendar tells us the date. But what I'm hearing from you is it starts with, yes, we say the date, but it's more the routine and the opportunity to engage. Whether or not it's something that happened specifically on this date, it's really an opportunity to have that chance to engage with each other. And the examples, when you first started giving them, you had mentioned that it was maybe a level 2 class, that novice mid to high proficiency level. And so if you're talking about a class that's a 3, 4, more advanced, do you see this as applicable to that level? Does it work there? Or is this more of a beginner type of activity?
I feel like calendar talk can work at any level. You are going to make some changes, of course. I have this concept that I call expand, extend, and deepen. If you take something, and I know your listeners can't see me right now, but you can expand things, make it broader, as in like using the same activities, but having variety or new variations, I should say. You can extend activities or extend the activity by adding in new features. And you can also deepen, which is adding complexity to further push those advanced students. And that's like kind of what I feel like you're talking about here. If we want to deepen the activity, I'll start doing things like asking for their opinion about it. So what do you think about this? That causes more than the just yes or no or A or B kind of answers. Also asking students like hypotheticals. If you could only have, let's say seasons again, if you could only have one season all year long, which one would you choose? And if you want to go even farther, you can always throw in the question why. So and then now we've got opinions, we've got arguments there, discussions that we could have about the topic. They take it well beyond like a level 1 or level 2 class.
Expand, extend, deepen.
Yeah.
Is that the correct order? So I want to make sure that's in the show notes, because that's one of those things that teachers are going to want to look back at and remember that. And that idea of taking a similar topic that could happen in that level 1, level 2 class, you could actually use the same prompts, and it's just what you're doing with them in the classroom. And I think teachers often get bogged down with new ideas means I have to create all these new materials, but you could actually use the same materials and the same prompts. It's just how you're engaging with them in the classroom. Have you specifically done that where you've had different level classes and you use the same prompts in a day?
Yeah, actually, my scaffolded slides in my calendar are the same from Spanish 1 through 4. It's just where I take them from the beginning level. And the higher levels know that we're going to go beyond that. The lower levels, it's at Spanish 1, beginning of the year, it's pretty much at face value because they're still getting the basics. But Spanish 4, they already know that we're going to ask lots of opinions. We're going to ask a lot of why and how kind of questions that go, much farther than just who and what and where kind of things.
So the amount of time you're spending with a lower proficiency level class it's going to be a shorter amount of time. And once you get into those why and how and if you could questions at the higher levels, you're going to spend more time on it. Do you ever find yourself where, we need to end this and move on to something else? Do you ever find yourself in that position?
Like I said, I kind of like to go where the class goes, but there are times where if it happens day after day, which sometimes happens in my class. For example, I have one activity that my students have really taken to the last couple of years, and it's called Special and Interesting Celebrations, which isn't something that I created, so it's not brand new out there. But looking at holidays and special national and world days that are across the world, and that can be anything from International Tongue Twister Day to National Bald is Beautiful Day. I try to do something a little more with that because just saying the day, there's not much to that. So what I usually do is I have a scaffolded slide that has a lot of circumlocution vocabulary on there. And so instead of me telling them, I have them guess. And those words are up there as a help or, as a scaffold if they need it. But after level 1, a lot of those students don't need that anymore. And that's an added bonus because now my students have mastered circumlocution vocabulary without me having to teach a lesson about it or have a quiz or a test, because they're using it in a natural, practical way, trying to figure out more information. And it works so well that, like I said, within a year, all of my students know how to circumlocute, which is probably one of the most valuable skills that you can teach a world language student.
You had mentioned earlier with a specific example about Argentina and what the weather was like and why is it there. I am curious to know more about how you're bringing culture into these conversations. Do you sort of plan in advance what you are assuming those cultural pieces might be, or is that more organic as culture comes into these conversations?
Well, if we were talking about like for example, those special and interesting celebrations, sometimes those align perfectly. Like there's a national or
Hmm.
an international flamenco day. So you can bet that I'm going to
Hmm.
show videos, play music, discuss like where it comes from, why, what's the cultural background there. But other times
Hmm.
it is super organic. I like to be very planned, but in the middle of the lesson, I'm very go with the flow. I don't necessarily have to control the direction, but I do have a plan for the day. But it's just a plan. It's not a Bible. It's
Hmm.
just a direction that, hey, this will be good, even if we don't get off task. But if
Hmm.
we get off task, and when I say off task, I mean we're still focused on language and learning. But if that
Hmm.
happens, so be it.
Maybe off
Yes.
topic, but still not off
There
task,
you go.
right? So we've maybe the topic's gone in a different direction, but we're still doing it in the target language. So if we have some teachers that are listening who have sort of yet to try this out in their classrooms and they want to try it out starting maybe tomorrow morning and their first class when they go in, what are some things to keep in mind? Your sort of pro tips for that beginner trying to do this?
Don't try to, necessarily try to do all the pieces that I've been talking about at once. Take one thing and try to expand on it, and then you can master that before you move on to adding a new thing. For example, let's say you wanted to incorporate some of the classroom jobs that I was talking about, like a sports director or activities director. Do that, and then that can be your focus for calendar talk now, discussing, hey, what are the activities and things on this date? And that can always be deepened or expanded in other ways. For example,
Mhm.
let's say there was a basketball game the night before. We could ask, how did the game go? Who won? Who lost? Or if there's a game tomorrow, who's going to win? Or who's going to be playing in the concert tonight? So you can take some basic information that you don't have to go searching for too hard. Like if your school has a website, like I said, or a calendar, it's not going to take a lot of planning to find that information, whether you present it or you have the students present it. And I
Mhm.
like to have the students present the information as much as possible because it sounds so
Mhm.
much more authentic coming from them, and they're much more invested. And the students get excited. Like if somebody's talking about
Mhm.
the big district game in, I don't know, football, basketball, soccer, whatever, the rest of the class perks up, especially if they're a player or their sister plays or their girlfriend plays or whatever.
And so, do you see the language that students are engaging with in these calendar talks coming up in other places in your classroom in their writing and their speaking? Can you give us maybe some examples of where you've seen a student refer back to something that came through a calendar talk in another area?
The area that I feel like has worked the best, like I said before, kind of was the circumlocution idea. Students now are so good in their writing and speaking, telling me things that they don't have the words for, but they can talk around it. Like they don't know the name of an animal, but they can say, oh, it's an animal that lives in Africa with four legs and lots of fur and has hair around its neck. I'm like, oh, a lion, which they probably could come up with that
Hmm.
anyways, but they may not know that leon means lion. It's just very gratifying to know that they can take a skill from one area and transfer it to another. And that's really what we're trying to do for their students. I feel like we don't
Hmm.
have enough time to teach them an entire language during their high school or junior
Hmm.
high careers or whatever you might teach. But if we can give them enough skills, even just success with the language, they're going to carry that much, much further.
Thinking back to when I asked you originally about keeping track of the new words, and I've had a bit of a mindset shift on how to use a calendar talk and the objective of it, because I was originally thinking it's a language learning tool, which it can be. There's organic and language learning coming in there, but it seems like it's actually more of a place to hone skills, where you were just talking about you see the skills that they're learning. And I think that that often comes up in those situations where students don't feel like they're going to be assessed on it and they can actually focus on the skills. So I do have a question about assessment. Do you ever use this as an assessment opportunity, or is this just a enjoy it skill building organic situation for students?
Boy, if I could never assess, I wouldn't. If there wasn't such a thing as a grade book, it would be even more organic. I I'm even with like going to a standards-based grading kind of thing, which I'm not, but I'm interested in. That's something I'd like to look a little more at. But even with that, I would like to grade them as little as possible. I want my classroom not to feel like a classroom. A lot of world language teachers have the idea that make it feel so different from any other area, like history and English and science. And it should. It's not the same kind of thing. We're acquiring things, we're not learning them. And since it's a language, yeah, I don't assess calendar talk. But it comes up pretty naturally. Like the things that they are learning and the things that they're acquiring, I should say, just come up in other areas spontaneously. And that's all I can really ask for.
Yeah, I assumed you were not assessing. I just wanted to make sure in case anyone had that question lingering. I think some teachers might have groups of students that if there's no assessment, they don't get the engagement, but I think a lot of what you mentioned earlier about it being personal to students, they know someone involved in the game, it's their own concert, like that's where the buy-in comes in more than the assessments there. So, do you have any recommendations that you would give to teachers if they are looking to learn more about this, or maybe something that's just informed your own teaching that keeps you interested that you could recommend to teachers?
Well, specifically with calendar talk, there are some teachers out there that I'm sure are doing it. I didn't invent this thing. If they want to find out more about my stuff, they can always go to my website, which is padredecinco.com. I do have some materials there. Like if you don't want to reinvent the wheel, you can certainly take a look there. I've got some of those basic scaffolding slides that I was talking about are available for you to find there, including my whole year of special and interesting celebrations. Yeah, I think the things that help motivate me, I'm a big conference goer. I love conferences. I wish I could go to more. I do go to a lot of the local ones, and so I do have to give a shout out to Comprehensible Iowa, who you mentioned at the beginning. That's our local homegrown grassroots conference here in Iowa. Also, Comprehensible Midwest, which is up in Wisconsin. That's run by several of my good friends. And if I was going to throw out some other names here. This isn't really calendar talk related, but if you wanted a couple other great people to follow, Kia London, who is an expert in equity and inclusivity. And also, if you're looking for some other comprehensible novels out there, Alicia Quintero and Teresa Jensen have some amazing novels. That's another big area of mine is reading in the classroom, and they've got some great, compelling products out there. So.
In terms of connecting with you, you mentioned your website is padredecinco.com. And how about on our social media or other ways to get in touch with you? And I know that I have watched a number of your reels. And everyone, if you're on Instagram, you need to get on there so you can watch John's reels. They're really great. But how else can we be connecting with you?
All right. On Instagram, that's the only one where I couldn't get my name. So it's Padre de Cinco Books in that case. Everything else is just Padre de Cinco. If you go to YouTube, I have a channel called Padre de Cinco where you can see the long form version of some of those Instagram reels. The best way to keep informed of anything that I'm doing or putting out there is I have a newsletter. And if you want, Joshua, I can send you a link for the show notes if they want to sign up for my newsletter, and then they'll just get stuff in their email on a regular basis.
So, as we end our conversation, I like to leave teachers with a hearty piece of advice. This could be about calendar talk. This could be about teaching, life. What can you share with us, a good piece of advice?
If you're trying to move to ADI, like acquisition-driven instruction, or some people call it TCI, teaching with comprehensible input, don't feel like you have to do everything right away. It is definitely a multi-year journey. Do not get stressed out about looking at some of these amazing examples of people online. They've been doing it for 5, 10, 20, 30 years sometimes. You've got to really just take something that seems amazing and interesting, whether it's calendar talk or telling classroom stories like TPRS style stories, or it could be incorporating classroom jobs. Take one piece, delve into it, try to make it as great as you can. I've been doing CI, I should say, for over 20 years, and I still have so much room to improve. So just take it easy. Don't feel like you have to do everything.
I was talking to someone the other day about language teaching and all of the new things and feeling like you need to try everything out, and to realize, as you were just saying, that it's going to be a slow process. And we live in this world of next day delivery. We live in this world of binge watch the entire TV show in one weekend. And so we have this immediacy of everything, and we just have to remember that's not how language acquisition is going to happen, so we just have to keep that in mind. I'm going to really try hard as I'm in my classroom to remember to expand and then extend and then to deepen, so that we can use some of our same resources at different levels and to just kind of go them that way. So that was a great nugget that I heard in there from you. So thank you, John, so much for everything that you shared. Very inspiring to try out using Calendar Talk in our classroom. And I hope everyone will spend time on your website looking into your templates and everything you can offer for trying out Calendar Talk in their classroom. So thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you, Joshua. I really appreciate you having me, of course.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with John Sifert? It became increasingly clear to me throughout the conversation that he loves to teach and uses Calendar Talk to get to know his students better and make them feel seen and valued in his classroom. Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with John Sifert, aka Padre de Cinco. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you would like to work together. We can do that in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.